Astrophysicist and cosmologist Dr. Hugh Ross recently sat down on the Glenn Beck podcast, and he laid out a comprehensive case of the scientific evidence and discoveries that led to him to go from an atheist to a believing and practicing Christian. I find this very interesting and pretty compelling, so I'm gonna let this clip play out, and then I'm gonna give my thoughts in between and give some feedback. Let's get into it.
But I started reading that Gideon Bible at age 17, and that was also the same time that physicists in South Africa and Britain were developing the first of the space-time theorems, which basically prove that space and time have a beginning. Space and time are created. And what I notice about the Bible is that it stood alone in making the claim that space and time are created entities. What I saw in the Eastern religions, space and time are eternal, and God or gods create within space and time that always exists. So seeing that the Bible said something different that was being affirmed by the space-time theorems, said maybe this book really is from the one who created the universe.
So can you take me through Genesis and the creation and
sure.
show me the science?
Well, I was taught the scientific method in grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. We got it all 12 years. And so when I picked up this book, the Bible, I looked at the first page, Genesis 1. I said, this perfectly follows the scientific method. It took me 9 years to discover why it so perfectly followed the scientific method. Right. That's where it comes from. It comes from the creation texts in the Bible and Reformation theology. But I looked at, Genesis 1, 2. The Spirit of God is hovering over the surface of the waters of planet Earth. And it gives you 4 initial conditions. It's dark everywhere on the surface, the water is everywhere, and the planet, Earth, is unfit for life and empty of life. Well, steps 1 and 2 of the scientific method are, do not interpret until you establish the frame of reference. The point of view is the surface of Earth's waters. And don't interpret till you also establish the starting conditions. What's all laid out in Genesis 1, 2. And I keep running into scientists who say Genesis teaches scientific nonsense. I said, well, Galileo said the biggest mistake you can make in Bible interpretation is to get the wrong point of view. And when they say it's scientific nonsense, they think God is above the earth, looking down on the earth and telling us what he did. Instead, it's God on the surface of the earth, looking up at the clouds and telling us what he did. Makes a huge difference in how you interpret the 6 days of creation.
He said that the Genesis creation story and Reformation theology gave birth to the scientific method, and I'm not sure I'd actually agree with that. I mean, the guy who created the scientific method, he was a Christian, and Christian thought was dominating science in that time, but I wouldn't necessarily credit Christianity for that. And he also mentioned Galileo, which I think is interesting because I often hear his name thrown around in an argument against Christianity about Christianity being anti-science. Because back then in Galileo's time, the Roman Catholic Church opposed his scientific findings because they thought it went against what the Bible teaches. There were 2 main Bible verses they used to say this. The first one being, he set the earth on its foundations, it can never be moved. And the sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it rises. But just because the Catholics took and interpreted these 2 Bible verses wrong doesn't make the Bible wrong or it being anti-science at all. And when he also said that the Eastern religions they think that space and time is eternal, I think he's kind of reducing it down a bit because there are different denominations among these faiths in Hinduism, Buddhism, Shintoism, Taoism, Confucianism, where they try and reconcile this. But for the most part in their mainstream accounts, I mean, for the most part, he's right. So if you're somebody who really shoots straight with science and you really rely on the scientific evidence, you're mostly looking at the major Abrahamic religions, which are Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. But now he's going to give us the scientific evidence that led him to his own belief in God that I am very excited to share with you. Let's see what it is.
Okay. And so, but yeah, nobody was helping me on this. I just saw this in the text and said, okay.
At 18?
17.
17.
Yeah. So I said, okay, creation day 1, let there be light. And I said, well, that's when the atmosphere goes from opaque to translucent. I knew enough about astronomy to realize Earth had to begin with an atmosphere 200 times thicker than it has today. An atmosphere that thick will not let any visible light through. The sun and stars existed, but there was no light on the surface of the waters of planet Earth. Day 1 is when the atmosphere was thinned out sufficiently that light could come through. And it says the Spirit of God was brooding over the surface of the waters. That implies the origin of life. So I saw life being originated at the beginning of creation day 1. And then you go into creation day 2, water above and water below. I really didn't have an idea what that meant. But when I got to the book of Job, it devotes 1.5 chapters to creation day 2 and basically describes it as God cycling water in the atmosphere above to the streams and lakes and oceans below and then back again.
Oh my gosh.
And actually describes 6 distinct forms of precipitation in Job 37 and 38. It mentions, for example, that there will be dew and mist and rain, and then snow and frost and hail. And again, I had enough science under my belt to realize that's the only way you can have billions of people living on the surface of the earth, because the Earth's water cycle is designed to ensure, no matter where you are, there's both frozen forms of precipitation and liquid forms, so we can have rivers and streams that flow all years round, and we have abundant food that can be grown everywhere. You need all 6 to make that possible. Then you get into creation day 3, and this is when land masses show up for the first time, when God transforms the earth from a water world to one with continents and oceans. And at 19, I got to take a course on plate tectonics. As far as I know, it was the first course in the world that was taught on plate tectonics at a university. That's because 2 of the 3 physicists who launched the discipline were at the University of British Columbia. Somehow I managed to get into that class as an undergraduate, and that's when they said, oh, the continents haven't always been here. It's plate tectonics that builds up the continents. And they thought it was a linear relationship from 0 to where it is today. Today we know that it takes deep oxygen cycle events to really accelerate the growth of the continental land masses. And so in 2018, they basically showed, for about the first billion years, you got nothing but water, and then plate tectonics kicks in. But at the first great oxygenation event 2.5 billion years ago, about 90% of the continental landmass forms.
Wow.
And so basically it shows that the more we learn about the past history of the earth, the tighter and tighter fit we get with what the Bible taught about these land masses thousands of years ago. And then it talks about vegetation on the land masses. And I've debated the executive director of the Skeptic Society 4 times in university campuses. He always jumped on Genesis, no matter what we were talking about, and because he saw that as the Achilles heel of the Christian faith. So he'd always say, well, the fossil record shows us we got animals before we got vegetation on the continents. I said, well, obviously, animals have skeletons and shells. That's going to be easily preserved. That's not the case for vegetation. It's going to decay. Right. But what happened in 2009 and 2011, 2 papers were published in Nature saying we now have the isotope evidence, and in 2011, the fossil evidence that vegetation was abundant on the continental land masses 600 million years before the first animals show up. So again, it shows, hey, as we learn more, it basically gives you a tighter and tighter fit.
What would they have eaten if there was no vegetation, if there was no...
Well, I think Michael Shermer was saying, there would have been vegetation in the oceans, but the biblical text says vegetation on the land masses. He said, we have no fossil evidence of that. Well, we didn't during my first debate, but we do now. We do have that evidence. And then creation day 4 is when creatures on the surface of the earth for the first time can see the sun, moon, and stars. And we now know the second great oxygenation event turned Earth's atmosphere from a dense haze to transparent. It's oxygen that determines how transparent the atmosphere is. And so an experiment was done where they took the atmosphere of the Earth, started with less than 1% oxygen and pushed it up. Well, the second great oxygenation event, the oxygen level suddenly goes from 2% to 8% for the first time in Earth's history. That's enough to make the atmosphere transparent.
Unbelievable.
That's exactly the same time that the first animals appear. Animals can't function if they don't know where the sun, moon, and stars are in the sky. They need a transparent sky. But what we see in the fossil record, the very moment oxygen hit that minimum level for animals suddenly appear. You go from nothing but microbial life to animals as big as 2 meters across. And then in creation day 5, you also have God creating the sea mammals and the birds. Only the second time it uses the word create. The word create in Hebrew, bara, is for something brand new at God's hand. And what was brand new was animals that are not just physical, but soulish, and that they have mind, will, and emotions, a capacity to form relationships with one another, their offspring. They sacrifice for the offspring. They also are endowed with a capacity to form relationships with a higher species, namely us human beings, and to serve and please us. Then you get into creation day 6. It doesn't talk about the first land mammals. It talks about the 3 categories of land mammals that are essential for launching human civilization. And Job 38 and 39 goes into that in great detail. And it's the short-legged land mammals, the rodents that we need for the clothing that humans were critically dependent upon when they first appeared. Because we humans, unlike the Neanderthals, are not adapted for a cold climate. We're fine in a warm climate, but not a cold climate. The rodents enabled us to go into cold climate zones. Then 2 different kinds of long-legged land mammals, those that are easy to tame, the herbivores we use for agriculture, those that are difficult to tame, the carnivores that we use for household companions. And last of all, God creates human beings, and only the 3rd time does it use the word create. Because what's brand new about us, we're not just physical and soulish, we're spiritual. As these birds and mammals were designed to relate to a higher species, we are designed to relate to a higher being, the one that created everything.
And on top of all that, the Bible also predicted one of the greatest scientific discoveries of mankind over 2,000 years ago, which is that the universe had a beginning. Granted, Richard Dawkins has pointed out that the Bible had a 50% chance of being right or wrong, so it was basically a coin flip. But the Bible got the coin flip right, and it's right about a lot of other things too. And this makes sense because if the Bible was true, we'd expect that its teachings about the universe would line up with science. And based on the evidence we just looked at and stuff, it looks like it does. And as John Lennox has pointed out, we're not the first people to recognize this. There have been many scientists, pioneers of modern scientists like Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Faraday, Maxwell. They were all believers in God. And C.S. Lewis has also further pointed out that men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator, that legislator being God. But God is not some impersonal, uncaring God. He is a God of love. He loves you and he loves me. And he designed us to be in a personal relationship with him. And because he designed us that way, anytime we chase after our own selfish desires and passions, it's ultimately gonna leave us unfulfilled. Because these things are not filling the God-shaped hole that we have in our heart. Before I found God a year and a half ago, I was an atheist. I believed in science, if that even makes sense. But I had this anxiety and depression, and I was struggling with addiction, and I was trying to fill my life with all these different things like girls and drugs and partying in college, but ultimately it wouldn't lastingly gratify me. It pleased me in the moment, but it just did not give me what Jesus Christ gave me, which is that peace and joy. And he got rid of my depression, my anxieties. He took away my addictions to drugs in a heartbeat. It was less than 24 hours. And I mean, I just can never go back now that I've seen all that Jesus Christ has done for me. I mean, like, we are sinners, but he gave me a new life. Like, I have a future glory in heaven, and I want you to go to heaven too, because God has made you to be rulers of heaven alongside him with me and all the other Christians in the world. And we want you to be there. We don't want you to go to hell. I mean, that is terrible. It is not my wish that anybody would go to hell, but I want you to go to heaven. And it is my prayer that this video helped reduce the leap of faith that it takes to call out to God. It makes it a little bit more reasonable. And I just encourage you to call out to God and to pray to him and ask him to reveal himself to you, to make himself known to you so that you won't be in doubt, but that you will know that he is the truth. And if you really want to have a real communication with him, I think a great place to start is reading the Bible, because he is up in the sky and we're down here, so we can only know what he reveals to us, and he's revealed to us the Bible. So if you want to talk to him, that's a great place to start. I recommend the Gospel of John. With that being said, if you want to see another video about the scientific evidence for God, maybe you have some more doubts, maybe you're not convinced yet, well, then I recommend checking out the video on screen right here. It goes into a lot of detail about that. I really enjoyed it myself, so go check that out. With that being said, y'all, have a great day, y'all. Bye-bye.